The most famous of the black men who fought in the cause of the Revolution was killed by a British soldier. During the Boston Massacre in 1770, 5 years before the outbreak of the war, he became the first martyr of the American Revolution. Fresh snow lay in Boston's icy streets on the night of March 5th, 1770, but the sky had cleared after dark and a new moon hung overhead. A cold wind from the harbor swept the Boston Common and shook the tents of British soldiers who had been camped there for 5 months. The streets were noisy as redcoats moved about, followed by bands of shouting civilians. The small city of 15,000 was crowded by men and boys who had come in from the country and nearby towns to help drive out the 1,000 redcoats just as if they were enemies. There were occasional scuffles, as there had been for weeks past. Soldiers jostled and cursed the people, who replied with hoots, curses, and insults. These soldiers were the first ever sent from England to America in peacetime, ordered to the city by King George III after the Massachusetts legislature had protested harsh new trade laws for the colonies. Now and then the redcoats were pelted by snowballs from the darkness, hundreds of frozen chunks with small stones in the center, and a fight broke out. No one seemed to know how it all begun. The church bells rang an alarm. People looked out from their houses, and many came into the streets armed with swords, axes, pitchforks, or boards ripped from old buildings. The crowds grew more daring as it became larger. A sentry by the name of Montgomery, who stood before the customs house on King Street, found himself surrounded by people after a young barber's helper yelled, "There's a redcoat who hasn't paid for having his hair dressed." "Shut up," Montgomery said. "Shut up," Montgomery said. The boy cursed, and then the soldier struck him on the head with his musket butt, and the barber's helper went yowling down the street holding his head. The crowd pressed about the sentry, chanting, "Hang the redcoats, drive 'em out." More church bells rang as the barber's boy returned to jeer and point at Montgomery. The crowd increased. Captain Thomas Preston, the officer of the day, called for the guard, and 12 soldiers hurried to the customs house. The crowd was forced back a few feet by bayonets and muskets. Captain Preston said, "We're not loaded." At that moment, as the civilians hesitated before the glistening blades, a small mob rushed down a nearby hill, its men armed with clubs. The newcomers were led by a burly black man named Crispus Attucks, who urged them on in a loud, fierce voice. People on the streets stepped aside as Attucks charged. As John Adams said, the giant's appearance was enough to terrify any person. The black leader had formed his men in Dock Square and led them down King Street, now State Street, trotting at the head of his company, his broad shoulders hunched. Crispus Attucks dashed within a few feet of the line of redcoats at the customs house and waved over his head a heavy stick of firewood. "Come on, bloody backs," he yelled. "Shoot if you dare, damn you!" We know you don't dare. The soldiers began loading their muskets. A young white man in the crowd begged Captain Preston to take his men back to their tents, but the officer refused. The soldier yelled, "Damn them! If they bother me, I'll fire!" The redcoats now held their muskets breast high, with fingers on the triggers. Crispus Attucks still towered over the captain, swinging his stick of wood and calling to his companions, "We're not afraid of them. Knock 'em over. They dare not fire." Beside him stood Samuel Gray, the owner of a rope factory, who had led an attack on some of the soldiers a few days before. Gray also shouted encouragement to the mob and said that the troops would not fire. A club sailed through the air, knocking aside a British musket. Suddenly a hail of snowballs, stones, clubs, sticks fell among the redcoats. The crowd raised a shout that rang through the streets, but above it rang an Indian war whoop from Crispus Attucks, who grabbed a bayonet with one hand and at the same time clubbed a soldier with his stick. The 12 muskets roared. Crispus Attucks fell with 2 bullets in his chest, the first one fired by Sentry Montgomery. Samuel Gray went down beside him. Both men died on the spot almost at the feet of the soldiers. Stray shots killed Jonas Caldwell, a sailor who was standing in the middle of the street, and two other whites, 17-year-old Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr, both of whom fell as they were hurrying towards the scene. 6 other civilians were wounded, but were to recover. The crowd fled, leaving the bodies behind, but as it grew and became noisier, it swarmed through the streets until it met Governor Thomas Hutchinson. The governor calmed the people by speaking to them from the balcony of a building. He promised to arrest Captain Preston and his men and to have the troops moved out of the city. The people then drifted away and returned to their homes. Strangely enough, the people of Boston knew almost nothing about Crispus Attucks, who was hailed as the first victim in the cause that was to become the American Revolution. Though little is known of his early life, Crispus Attucks is thought to have been the son of an African father and an Indian mother, the mother who belonged to the Attuck tribe, the Natick tribe, was probably descended from John Attucks, a Christian convert who was executed by early New England colonists because he sided with his tribe during an Indian uprising known as King Philip's War. Attuck was the word for deer in the Natick language. John Attucks was on King Philip's Metacomet's War, and Metacomet was Massasoit's son. That was the son of Massasoit. You English sons of bitches don't have good intentions, do you? By the time he had grown to manhood, Crispus Attucks was a slave, the property of William Brown of Framingham, Massachusetts. But even as a slave, young Crispus Attucks was unusually independent. He became well known in his hometown as a trader of horses and cattle, shrewd enough to deal with free white men. But though he kept for himself the money he made, Crispus Attucks was unable to buy his freedom from his master, and he was fiercely determined to be free. At last, in the autumn of 1750, he took the only way to freedom that was open to him. He ran away. Brown advertised in the Boston Gazette on October 2nd, 1750, ran away from his master, William Brown of Framingham, a mulatto fellow about 27 years of age named Crispus, 6 feet 2 inches high, short, curled hair, his knees nearer together than common, had on a light-colored bearskin coat. But though Brown offered 10 pounds as a reward, Crispus Attucks was never caught, nor was he heard from again in Massachusetts until the night 20 years later when he reappeared as the leader of the patriotic mob on March the 5th, 1770. It is thought that Crispus Attucks may have spent his 20 years of freedom as a sailor working on cargo ships that sailed to and from the West Indies, but this is not certain. He is also said to have sailed whaling ships off the New England coast. The stranger, who had appeared just in time to give the white mob the courageous leadership to attack the redcoats, was praised by white revolutionaries as the bravest of the victims of the street fight. As Thomas Jefferson said, the blood of Crispus Attucks nourished the tree of liberty. The humble slave who had the courage to flee his master and make a new life on his own had been among the first Americans to die for that nation's liberty. 3 days later, a public funeral was held for the victims of the street battle. All the shops in the city were closed. Thousands of people flocked in from the nearby countryside. The Boston Gazette reported that the funeral was attended by the largest crowd ever assembled in North America. The bodies of Crispus Attucks and Caldwell, which had lain in their coffins at Faneuil Hall because they had no homes in Boston, were carried to meet the other hearses in King Street near the scene of the shootings. A long procession then followed the black carriages to the cemetery where the victims were buried in one grave. John Adams was to write of the Boston Massacre. Years later. On that night, the foundations of American independence were laid. But though they could not foresee this, future patriotic leaders who were trying to stir up trouble for the British made sure that the deaths of the 5 men were not forgotten. The Boston Gazette published an account of their deaths with black borders of mourning, with pictures of coffins, skulls, and crossbones. Samuel Adams began to write of the clash between soldiers and civilians as the Boston Massacre, the name by which it is known to this day. Paul Revere, the silversmith, an engraver who was secretly working for the Revolution, copied a drawing of the massacre by a Boston artist and published it, one of the most famous engravings of American history. Thousands of copies were circulated throughout the colonies. to create sympathy for the people of Boston and hatred of the British troops. Captain Preston and several of his soldiers were tried in Boston. The captain was found not guilty since the court ruled that he had acted to protect his troops. 2 soldiers who were found guilty were branded in the hand with a hot iron. This did not satisfy the Patriot leaders. 3 years later, John Adams called on the memory of the victims of the Boston Massacre to help cause an open break between America and England. John Adams sent Governor Hutchinson a letter that would not be forgotten, a letter that he pretended had been written by a dead man. It was actually meant for use in newspapers. Sir, you will hear from us with astonishment. You ought to hear from us with horror. You are chargeable before God and man with our blood. The soldiers were but passive instruments in our destruction. You were a free agent. You acted coolly, deliberately, with malice, not against us in particular, but against the people in general, which in the sight of the law is murder. You will hear from us hereafter. The signature in Adams' own hand was Crispus Attucks. It was to be many years later before the great orator Daniel Webster declared that the Boston Massacre was the turning point in the long struggle between England and her rebellious American colonies. From that moment, Webster was to shout, "We may date the severance of the British Empire." The reckless bravery of Crispus Attucks had helped change the course of history. Crispus Attucks. Fucking shit, man. Didn't know you were going to get to me like that. So, I didn't actually hear the story per se, but the redcoats are the fucking, the cops, right? They're the police officers. And they're all listening to King George III, a monarch over, the fucking Atlantic. And they're all authoritarian, dictating fucking assholes, oppressing dudes. They're the cops, right? The redcoats were the cops. And they're the redcoats. So I'm kind of mixed between the idea that they're the police and they have bright red on. Well, they're like, we're the officials, we're here. And that's very powerful. That's actually one of the most powerful displays ever. A lot of police officers want to do this undercover shit, but my God, you come in with all suited and booted with your uniform and your hat and your badge, and you come in with your car and your sirens and your lights. It's what the French did when they marched through Kentucky. And it was, nobody fired upon them because it was so brazen, but it was also the French saying, this is our land, this is our territory, this is our... I'll just read some quotes here. It's always the right time to do the right thing. It's always the right time to do the right thing. You don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step. We have no right to believe that freedom can be won without struggle. If you're not prepared to die for freedom, then put freedom out of your head. It's a Malcolm X quote. I don't care if I fall as long as somebody else picks up my gun and keeps on shooting. One has to grow hard, but without ever losing tenderness. Our youth must always be free, discussing and exchanging ideas concerned with what is happening throughout the entire world. Che Guevara.